Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stanton Hudson. I'm the Executive Director of the Theodore Roosevelt Inaugural National Historic Site here in Buffalo, New York. And I am extremely pleased to be here tonight to introduce a longtime friend of mine, Terry Alford. On March 2nd, 2020, Terry Alford began his service as the full-time Executive Director of the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor. Terry is responsible for leading the effort to create a unified strategic plan that will maximize the opportunity of this unique multi-destination attraction that includes the Michigan Street Baptist Church, Nash House Museum, Colored Musicians Club, and WUFO Black History Collective, among other important assets. He is currently leading efforts to facilitate the operationalization of all facets of the plan. Terry Alford is a seasoned manager administrator with more than 25 years of nonprofit leadership experience and is a results-oriented professional with expertise in management, marketing, public relations, and community capacity building. Most recently, he served as the Advancing Tobacco-Free Communities Community Engagement Program Manager at Ciccatelli, is that right? Ciccatelli Associates. Prior to that, he served in various leadership roles for 18 years at Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center, including as director of the Erie Niagara Tobacco-Free Coalition, where he oversaw a $2 million annual budget and managed the day-to-day operations of the coalition on behalf of the New York State Department of Health, including marketing, promotion, don't you? Public relations, and community engagement. Terry holds a master's degree in organizational leadership from Medaille University with honors and a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology with a minor concentration in urban planning from Buffalo State University. His community activities have included serving in leadership roles within the St. Martin de Porres Parish, President and CEO of Health Initiatives for Men, co-founder of Men Allied for the Need to Understand Prostate Cancer, and co-founder and president of the African American Roswell Employee Network. He was honored by the Sigma Beta Delta Honor Society in 2015, was St. Martin de Porres Roman Catholic Church Holy Name Society's 2016 Man of the Year, and was Roswell Park Comprehensive Cancer Center's Living the Dream 2014 Employee of the Year. Terry, a native of Buffalo, was raised with 4 siblings by parents who made residence in neighborhoods bordering or near the Michigan Avenue corridor. He is the proud father of 1 daughter, Violet, and the grandfather of 2, Miles and Autumn. Terry presently resides on the east side of the city with his wife, Lori. As I said, I've known Terry since his time with the Erie Tobacco Coalition. As many of you may know or can imagine, convening a successful coalition can sometimes be akin to herding cats. Terry was masterful in developing one-to-one relationships with every coalition member, resolving conflicts, I'm going to get new glasses here, enlisting members' active support, understanding each group's self-interests, and helping to translate them into solid programs, and communicating positions on difficult, controversial issues. I often marveled at how Terry's low-key approach brought about such impactful results. When the inaugural site decided to reinvent itself in the early 2000s, the board and staff worked diligently with museum professionals for nearly 2 years to create a one-of-a-kind experience, an interactive multimedia experience which encompassed much more than a single event that took place more than a century ago and lasted less than 10 minutes. Our reimagined historic site now gives our nearly 30,000 annual visitors opportunities to explore issues that surely had to be on the mind of Theodore Roosevelt the day he took the oath of office here, issues that were consequential throughout his presidency, and issues that are no less relevant today than they were 122 years ago. Immigration and urban poverty, race and social inequities, environmental conservation, big business and labor, and the U.S. role in global affairs. I'm hopeful, Terry, that there will be opportunities for our two organizations to work together in the future to enhance both residents' and visitors' knowledge and appreciation for the Buffalo area's rich history. With that, it gives me great pleasure in introducing Terry Alford.
Stan, that was long. You can all go home now. You just gave my presentation? Anyway, thank you, Stan, and thank you to the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site for having me, and more importantly, for having the African American Heritage Corridor come and speak tonight. I look forward to this when Stan and Patricia first approached me on it. I was more than just flattered. I was, very much honored to be asked. If someone asked me 10 short years ago if I would be here to Theodore Roosevelt, I would think you was nuts. So I'm very happy and looking forward to sort of share with you what's going on in our beloved corridor, what we're doing on the east side of Buffalo, and hopefully, you can learn a little something tonight. So with that, let's get going on this. So, it's funny, when I dressed tonight, I didn't know I was going to actually dress the same. So I really need to look at my headshots before I come here. But Stan gave a very sterling thank you for the very flattering introduction in terms of who I am and what I am and where I come from. My family is here, in terms of my wife Lori's in the audience. As equally important to that is my church family is here too. St. Martin de Porres. If you want to know about a story, you should learn about the St. Martin de Porres story. It's quite unique, and one day you should have us up here talking about what makes us unique as Black Catholics. It's an amazing story if you've never heard it. Another time. But with that said, I am a proud son of the east side of Buffalo, in particular of the Michigan Street African Corridor, the Heritage Corridor, if you will. I grew up in those historic neighborhoods that we will talk about, some of which you might know: Fruit Belt, Cold Spring, Maston Park, Willard Park. These are all historic neighborhoods that connect to my beloved corridor. And with that said, it helped mold me, not just the people that I grew up with or I mentored under, the community. I remember a community that was tree-lined with gardens and vibrant businesses, proud homeowners in this corridor. So when I was hired in this position 3 short years ago, I'll tell anybody that listens, that's my dream job. I worked 18 years at Roswell Park, quite unique stories there. Stan Martin didn't mention that one of the other board members of that coalition was Mary Craig, who's over here. And I'll talk about Mary in a minute too. But it helped mold me to be in the position I am now. You mentioned about herding cats. I deal with 5 separate board of directors, okay? 3 of which are well over 100 years old, with their own unique cultures. If they're African American, they have their own unique cultures, mores, ways of doing things. Part of my job is helping to mold that to create one cohesive community that can advance and a transformational change that's very much needed in a quarter that has been without for at least 7 decades now. So when I talk to Stan and Patricia in terms of what we talk about, what do you want me to share in terms of the corridor, I suggested that we connect some things in terms of what was happening with the the Pan American Exposition in 1901, and what was happening in other parts of the community, much of which 90% of Buffalo didn't know what's going on. In fact, they didn't know what's going on in their own exposition, during the exposition. And I just found that amazing. The great thing about history, I'll just share this real quick, is the stories. In full disclosure, I am not a historian, but my letters after my name has nothing to do with history. But I love history. I love the stories that's connected to the rich histories of not just African American community, but in general, the Buffalo experience, the Western New York experience. The Western New York connected with the Canadian experience. It's unique stories that really help mold this community, if you will. So, with that said, the Pan Exposition in Buffalo was quite stirring in terms of the symbolism of things that was happening in African American community and in the city itself, and for that matter, for the nation itself. So when the exposition came to Buffalo, the organizers of the World Fair decided that Buffalo would be a good place, mainly because of the railroads, people could get around easier, but the other part of that is it was seen as a progressive city at the time. You had certain technologies that was introduced at the time. In fact, you look at the pictures on this wall and you see it. You see an expo that's lit up with lights. So I found that amazing when they said Buffalo was selected because it was progress in the early part of the 20th century. However, the year before in Paris, France, they had their expo. And the same reasons why the organizers selected Paris as the site for the World Fair that year. It was a progressive city. Okay, but when you use that word progressive, what does that truly mean? Okay, the organizers in Paris decided to celebrate technology, celebrate how the world was advancing, in split seconds, if you will. Paris also did something unique. They wanted to celebrate world cultures, everyone's world cultures, no matter how progressive or how civilized, quote unquote, they were. They wanted to really extol the values and celebrate, the values and the attributes of everyone's culture. That included an exhibition from the States. It was called the Negro Exhibition. Okay, it was put together by W.E.B. Du Bois, some other leading activists of the time. And the folks in Paris wanted to celebrate the Negro, progress, especially after the Civil War, after the Emancipation Proclamation, but then after, the restoration of the South, the Jim Crow that was coming in, and despite all that, wanted to celebrate all the great things that African Americans, the contributions they were making in the United States, especially in places that really look their noses down at people like us, people of color itself. So the organizers in Buffalo wanted to also, and by the way, this is the exhibition, the Negro Exhibition in Paris. The goal of the exhibition was to demonstrate progress and commemorate the lives of African Americans at the turn of the century. So that was quite unique. However, the Pan Exposition in Buffalo had plans of also exhibiting, the African American experience. But the two exhibits that they want to promote sort of focused on really promoting this idea of stereotypes. And those two exhibits included the Old Plantation exhibit and something called Darkest Africa. And these exhibits were primarily in the Midway. That's where most of the people congregated. That's where they all went in between the Temple of Music and other temples that were promoted and featured at the exhibition. And let me read something here about this. The African village, for instance, inhabitants promoted and featured African warriors from Darkest Africa, Assago throwers, Zulus, and cannibals. The Pan American Exposition and paraders featured a theme of human progress from savage, usually people of color, to civilized, or usually products of European industries. And a lure was made for the Victorians to titillate with nudity of savages, legitimized 62 people supposedly representing 35, they called it tribes at that time, which were brought to Buffalo to demonstrate weapons, handcrafts, songs, and dances and witchcraft. The Old Plantation exhibition freely portrayed African American life with bigotry, disrespect. Laughing Ben, Dublin, Georgia, or from Dublin, Georgia, was the Old Plantation's image of genial and compliant good Negroes. There was a cabin from Thomas Jefferson's estate passed off as a typical African American home. So they really promoted and celebrated this notion of antebellum South, but they never talked about, slavery. They never talked about the ravages and issues related to slavery, and after that, Jim Crow, what have you. This one right here. I'm sorry. Here we go. So, when you see this, imagine some of the African Americans of name, especially those who espouse this notion of African American progress and pride and the contributions that they just didn't make to this country, but made to the world in general. So, low African Americans in particular, if I use the word stand, pissed off, like you won't believe. But in particular, national figures like W.E.B. Du Bois, Big Booker T. Washington, who frequented the Pan American Expo during those early months, and were really just alarmed with what was being exhibited at the time. So some of these figures I have here, Reverend J. Edward Nash, who was the longest serving pastor of the Michigan State Baptist Church at the time. There he's about in his 30s. W.B. Du Bois, who of course was not considered a good Negro by many. He was a rabble-rouser. He was seen as kind of like just being too progressive in his thinking. But of course, Mary Talbot. And Mary, you know about Mary Talbot. If you don't know Mary Craig, she's one of the more prominent actors in this area. I'm going to embarrass you. And one of the things that she really does in terms of promoting immersive tour, the notion of bringing to life some of these individuals, historical individuals, included Mary Talbot. How many of you by show of hands know who Mary Talbot is? That's good. That's what I have to remember. So Mary Talbot at the time was a member of the Phyllis Wheatley Club, which included women, especially women of means, educated women, who wanted in many different ways to uplift the community, uplift African Americans and their plight. They were also very instrumental in bringing to light, along with Ida B. Wells, the issues associated with lynchings. Now, mind you, in the 1900s, 1901, African Americans, especially in the South, were being terrorized. And lynchings, church burnings were just going through the roof. So Phyllis Wheatley, people like Mary Talbert, people like Ida B. Wells, really spoke out against those things. Now, mind you, this is always happening at the same time with the Pan American Exposition. Okay, so I'm going to say this. Women in general are tough, and women, a strong woman tends to make things move. When you assemble a group of women, especially if they're focused on getting something done, usually happens. When you get highly upset black women together, okay, especially on this notion that they were really promoting these two exhibits, and ignoring their asks and their requests to bring the Negro exhibit and be a part of the exposition. They were just being ignored. So these women didn't lie down quietly. The Phyllis Wheatley Club, a group called the National Association of Colored Women, that was founded by Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass's daughter, amongst other people, all came together and started really getting on the cases of the organizers of the Pan American Exposition. At first they were ignoring the request, but after a presentation made by Mary, and I'm going to look for it here real quick, she presented a presentation an essay that was, they used to call it back in those days. It was entitled, "Why the American Negro Should Be Represented in the Pan American Exhibition." It was covered, and when she did this, it was right at the Michigan Street Baptist Church where she read this essay that was attended by really instrumental figures of the African American community at the time, who were coming to Buffalo to really look at this exhibit, these two exhibits, and expressing real beef with that, okay? So after she read it, what moved these people, these organizers, was the black press. It was covered by black newspapers primarily, and then that started leaking up to mainstream press at the time. And why the organizers decided to relent and allow this exhibit to be moved into the exhibit, the Negro exhibit, was primarily because the world was watching. If you remember the Civil Rights Movement, one of the reasons why that movement was so successful was television. You had Martin Luther King and those organizers utilized media to bring, the tribulations of African Americans to the world. And that's very embarrassing when you're supposed to be the most progressive country in the world, okay? The most liberal, you espouse freedom. So that's what started changing minds at the time. So the exhibit was finally featured, but not in the Midway, where most of the folks were. It was tucked away, as they called it, in some obscure temple. And I don't think any of the temples were really obscure, but most of the people weren't going to arts and culture, okay? They were going to these other exhibits, including the Old Plantation and Dark Africa. And mind you, those two exhibits, along with those other exhibits that featured communities of color from around the world, were actually under this umbrella that they called human zoos, okay? So this is what was all happening in 1901. However, because of the success of getting this exhibit into the exposition, what transpired from that was that really emboldened African Americans, not just locally, but around the nation, that if you come together and you stick with it, that in the end you can get what you want. That created more progressive thinking, that really created more enlightened thinking especially with African Americans, in terms of literature, education, science. And they all started forming other groups. I mentioned some of the other groups already. Phyllis Wheatley blew up as a result. The National Colored Women blew up as a result. And then new groups were created, okay, which included the Niagara Movement. In fact, the Niagara Movement, if you don't know the story, was actually founded in the home of Mary Talbot. Mary Talbot's home actually used to be right next to the Michigan Street Baptist Church. That's where she and her husband, along with Reverend Nash, who lived around the corner basically, they entertained all these national figures, including W.E.B. Du Bois, and after some discussion, that's where they founded the freedom, the Niagara Movement. The Niagara Movement is the precursor to the NAACP. So the NAACP's birthplace is in Buffalo, New York, if you didn't know that. Okay, so these movements really started in terms of advancing the race in some way, and then pushing it back against this notion of marginalization from the mainstream. What's interesting though is when the Negro exhibit was probably allowed to be placed in the exhibit, it was primarily ignored by the mainstream media. In fact, the newspapers, the main newspapers of the day, in describing the Negro exhibit, basically says it was fluff, it didn't mean anything, okay, it's terrible. Every negative term or word that you can use for an exhibit was used for it. And unfortunately, even today, not a lot was written about that exhibit. Not a lot of pictures were taken of it. So that one grainy picture I showed us was like one of the few that we can find. The only references to the Negro exhibit came with some pamphlets that were found by some researchers that were looking into the exposition itself. I'm going to always show this because where we are, obviously, is the Theodore Roosevelt inaugural site, and the unfortunate events of assassination attempt of the president at the time, William McKinley, sort of led in so many other ways the continued progress of not just the African American community, but the African American community in Buffalo in general. So here you see William McKinley ascending the Temple of Music to enjoy an evening. This is where the assassin, and by the way, how do you pronounce his name? Leon Sogas, thank you. This is where he attempted to kill the president. He was able to shoot him twice. The third shot, the third attempt, was stopped by an African American man. Now, when you look up pictures of this event, okay, it's stirring to notice that in most of the photos of this tragic event, you don't even see the gentleman who stopped, the assassination attempt. I mean, the third shot would have killed the president, obviously. He died later, as you know, from infection, most of it. But if it wasn't, and in fact, this is like one of the few pictures I found. The gentleman who's grabbing Sogas by the shoulder is this gentleman here. James Benjamin Parker. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia, to slave parents. Just about this, as he grew up, with the Emancipation Proclamation, they were free. He worked a variety of different jobs as an adult. He came to Buffalo for opportunity. He wanted to work at the Pan American Exposition. At the time, a lot of people floating Buffalo in order to get work, especially African Americans. So he worked right in the Midway itself. And what I read in the research I did was he was actually about to leave the job because he was going to go to another job back in Atlanta, Georgia, I believe. So he wanted to go see the president at the Temple of Music because he thought he was going to be conducting a speech there. When he heard he was just going to be there shaking hands. He almost didn't go, but at the last minute he decided to go anyway. So when he was there, when Schultzgauss attempted to take the third shot, he grabbed Schultzgauss, spun him around, hit him in the nose, tackled him, and stopped, the assassination attempt at the time. He was immediately approached by folks who wanted to get souvenirs from him. They asked for buttons off his coat and other personal items. He immediately got an offer to do some advertisement, commercials and things. He declined all those offers because he did not want to use this tragic event for personal gain, if you will. So he was lauded by a number of people, including Booker T. Washington, but a preacher, Lena Doolin, wrote a poem praising Parker for his action, a Negro in it, casting him as latest in a long line of African Americans who risked their lives in service to this country. And it's interesting that was written because at the time of him saving the president, well, he thought he saved the president at the time, he was known to say, well, good old Abe is thanking me. He helped me, so now I'm helping one of his, okay? But because he recounted the event that night of what happened, and then the next day he recounted it in a different way, people started questioning if he was actually the person who saved the president, believe it or not. And what ended up happening was a gentleman named James Quackenbush, and I thought that name was interesting, Quackenbush. Hopefully there's no Quackenbushes here. But he questioned the legitimacy of his story, and as a result, they try to marginalize him and do away with his story and his place in history. But again, African-American woman says, oh no, we're not gonna let that happen. And over the course of several years after that, they were able to get him in front of audiences and talk about the issues and recant what happened. Now, you might ask why I'm bringing this up, okay? The point of why I'm bringing this up is, it's very important who tells your story. It's very important who tells your story. You can't allow others necessarily to tell your story. Now, this is not critical race theory, it's history. History is factual. If you do your research, you can debate history, okay, as they say, but you can't debate facts. Okay, you can't debate truth. You have to accept history and all this ugliness and all this beauty at the same time. Okay, that's what makes us, students of this. This is what allows us to appreciate the importance of history, the benefits of it. But if you let others marginalize your history or try to do away with it, then what do you have at that point? It's not really true history. So it's important for us to say that because one of the things that we advocate, especially in our corridor, is the importance of telling history and telling the stories and making sure that these stories are passed down that are factual and true. I like to go around and when I do presentations, I always talk about those people whose shoulders we stand on. Okay, we lost a number of different people over the last 5 years alone. I think about Bishop William Henderson, who was the longest-serving pastor, one of the longest-serving pastors at the Michigan Street Baptist Church. In fact, I credit him with kind of like saving this corridor. Quick story. Back in the 80s, the city, for whatever reason, was just indiscriminately knocking down buildings on Michigan Avenue. They had just knocked down a building that used to be right next to that small cottage over there. And the bishop who was doing service in the church at the time heard the commotion, and full vestments came out and saw this wrecking ball about to knock down the church. So he placed his body between that wrecking ball and the church. There's pictures of this. And as a result of that, at the time, he was not a historian, he was not a preservationist. He became one that day, where he says, we got to stop knocking things down here, especially edifices that carry so much significance not just to the African American experience, but to the history of America itself. This is another photo of the Michigan Street Baptist Church. It was one of the last stations of the Underground Railroad. Next to this brick home, which would have been this way, was Mary Talbert's home itself. That small cottage over there used to serve as the headquarters for the Chinese Businessmen Association. Okay, so again, when you look at the history of the corridor, you talk about 185 years worth of history here of the African American experience. But before then, there was immigrants, there was all kinds of people, and by the way, they were all living together, you know, in this really, you know, people like to use the word melting pot. It was a community of people who were working together, living together, worshiping together, and doing business together. And they weren't necessarily looking at their colors or where they came from. They were looking to survive, basically. Because back in those days, that was the name of the game. You had to live. So, quick history about the corridor itself. And this is what I was saying when I remember it. And I'm not going to tell you my age soon. This is really what I kind of like grew up with in Michigan Avenue, under that larger picture over here, where you had trees. Now, this photo is probably taken sometime in the late 40s, early 50s, but it's sort of represented at the turn of the 20th century what this neighborhood primarily looked like. It was the density of houses stacked next to each other was amazing. Something like what you might see in Harlem, New York, or Philadelphia. But you had vibrant businesses, you had homeowners, you know, and they were all commercing together. You had a dollar that stayed in this community where it exchanged hands at least 13 times before it left the community. So you had a healthy economic ecosystem, if you will, in this community. Some of the other photos, I love old pictures, included, you know, some of the businesses down to far right is a taxi cab company. Up in the upper right are young ladies at one of the local taverns. And back in those days, you had such places as Little Harlem, the Mojo, Color Musicians Club. I'm sure if I go around, especially to some of you older folks, you can give me more nightclubs that I'm not even thinking of right now. The upper left is the Michigan Street YMCA. At one time, it held the same reverence as the church did, and for some people, even more. This was kind of like the first stop for folks who were coming into Buffalo and trying to make a life, trying to make a community grow. So it serves much more like a convention center for the African American community. If you wanted to start a business, if you wanted to join an organization, if you want to run for office, this is where you normally started. Okay, you started here. So this served as kind of like the central location for the community at that time. This lower left photo is ladies from, I believe, was the Little Harlem. Upper right is from the another picture from the Little Harlem. In fact, I believe that's Montgomery, right? That's Dan Montgomery's over here. Thank you. That's okay. You can correct me. That's Dan Montgomery's. So Dan Montgomery and Ann Montgomery were married at one time, and Dan Montgomery's, his business was Dan Montgomery's. It used to have really great steaks. It was further up the street towards the south, if you will. So again, these were great locations where people played and commerced and got entertained. And of course, the Color Musicians Club, photo from there, and that's a photo of Little Harlem. So these type of businesses are prevalent in the community. This photo is, if you're looking down aerially, this is going towards the south, if you're looking towards the water, if you will. This is what the present state of the corridor is, especially the corridor that I'm primarily focusing on. So you can see right here, Colored Resistance Club, the present location of Buffalo Radio, which would be Broadway here. Across the street is the Michigan Street Baptist Church, our iconic archway. And then you can't see it, but farther that way where the trees are is the Reverend J. Edward Nash house, where he and his wife and their son resided for a number of years. Quick, some information about the commission or the Heritage Corridor itself. For those of you who don't know, this is primarily what I'm doing and what we're doing as a Heritage Corridor in terms of trying to transform this community. The corridor represents about 3.5 miles. It starts, we like to say it starts at Michigan and Seneca. It stakes all the way down to Michigan and East Ferry. That corridor passes at least, I call it 5 historic neighborhoods. In fact, our mission primarily is that we endeavor to integrate the cultural significance of African Americans and the impact that they made on the city of Buffalo, but I like to include in the Western New York region and in the United States, period, okay? And we do that through a number of different ways. We do it through public participation, community education that hopefully excites and invigorates love of our culture, preservation, and of course, economic community development. We serve primarily as the connector of the past, present, and future of those historic neighborhoods, which includes Maston Park, the Fruit Belt, Willard Park, Cold Spring. If you drove down the corridor, you see different places of development happening, especially nearer the medical corridor, which is parallel to that. At one time, our corridor was a site where a lot of certain developers, I'm not going to name names, are salivating because primarily it parallels the medical corridor, and everyone continue to see that as a cash cow. You have one particular developer that owns 90% of empty lots along this corridor that's still empty. So these are things that we're working to do. But the corridor, mission developers, the corridor, the commission was actually created and founded in 2007 primarily to protect the historic and integrity and the history of the corridor itself. It was led by now New York State Assembly, I should say Majority Leader, Crystal Peoples-Stokes, who herself is a product of the community, but she was primarily just tired of things being knocked down, torn down, razed, and nothing being built up. So this was an attempt to at least save the integrity primarily around those three anchors being the Michigan Street Baptist Church, the Nash House, and the Colored Musicians Club and Museum. We now also include Buffalo Radio and their Black Radio History Collective. They're now considered a founding anchor too, but they're within steps of each other. One of the things that we're lucky about is the fact that there's steps for one another. There's not too many districts like this across the country where you have this kind of history all basically connected in some way. And the stories are basically, two degrees of separation. Most of everything began at the church. And what came out of that was the Nash House, okay? And what came from there was folks who helped found the Colored Resistance Club. And then what preceded of that was the continued development of the corridor, especially through social means and things. So this is primarily was the initial goal of creating and developing this historic district that led to the creation of what we called then our commission. There was a need for a coordinating body. We needed to really promote this idea of collective unity. Three of those anchors, the oldest ones, weren't working together. They were working separately, promoting community engagement, celebration, and trying to find more funding itself. But what was lacking was a large capacity support funding that could hire staff like myself, that can continue the day-to-day operations and things. So at this point, everyone always asks, where do you get your money from? Mm-hmm. Well, this is the breakdown. So if you remember the $1 billion fund when then Governor Coleman came in and created this $1 billion to help really develop the city of Buffalo because it's upstate New York City. A lot of that money the first couple of years was not seeing any pathway to the east side of Buffalo. Now, we look at the east side of Buffalo, it represents 2/3 of the city of Buffalo. And 2/3 of this city is still predominantly inhabited, lived, resided, commerce by people of color. So when that occurred, when nothing was occurring really on the east side of Buffalo besides the Northland Workforce Training Center, people like Christopher People Stokes and other leaders talked to the governor and said, you need to do something about this to address this because we need to really develop this particular part of the town. This is where the most need is. So from that point, carved out $65 million, which was going to be focused on 4 commercial corridors, which included Michigan Avenue, Jefferson, Fillmore, and the Bailey Avenues area. From that point, there was another $8 million that was contributed by local private and public organizations like the Oceanic Foundation. These entities threw money in a pot to the tune of close to $8 million at the time to really focus on providing capacity support for those organizations like the Heritage Corridor who didn't have capacity at the time to manage multi-million-dollar projects. So with this capacity funding, it's used to not just provide operational dollars to hire staff, but also to hire consultants, to provide services and resources that can continue to advance the progress and the continued growth of organizations like ours. So that $65 million was, by the way, is called the Empire State Development Economic Development Fund, or East Side Development Fund, focused on 9 target areas on the east side on those 4 corridors that I already mentioned. And some of these projects, it includes our 3 anchors, 3 of them anyway, besides Waffle Radio, Martin Luther King Park, Broadway Market, Central Terminal, Northland Corridor Workforce Training Center. There was also funds that were provided to the local Buffalo Niagara Preservation group to provide funds to those proprietors, those folks who work out of older buildings, especially these 100-year-old buildings that needed stabilization. So there was a good number of monies that was provided as part of this fund with the idea, obviously you can't save the whole world, but the idea is if you can save and do certain things with certain projects, the hope is that could really stimulate and kickstart economic development in these corridors. That includes Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor, which the focus was on heritage destination, tourism, primarily. The other 3 are business districts, primarily. So out of that $65 million that was primarily dedicated to capital funds, about $7 million, a little over $7 million, was initially carved out for the corridor, namely for stabilizations, renovations, expansions of 3 of our historic anchors. So I'm sorry for the images, it might be small, but to the far left here is the renderings of what the new Michigan Street Baptist Church will look like, hopefully within another year or 2. This past summer, they spent the entire summer stabilizing the inside, the foundation, the roof of that historic site. That church is closer to 200 years old. So over the years, if you happen to walk in there, you would have saw 2 large steel girders holding up the roof, basically. When I started, the first day I started, hopefully it wasn't a premonition, but the first day I started, one of the walls buckled on the bottom foundation of the church, so a huge gaping hole opened up, right? So I remember going with the board to look at this hole, but when you peered in the hole, it's kind of like looking at history because that hadn't been opened up for like 200 years, right? So we were able to get it fixed quickly with the help of our benefactors and things. The church is also looking to do an expansion that will include an annex that will mirror kind of similar to how the homes back in the early 19th century, the early 20th century, I should say, might have looked like. It'll also include other exhibits that enhance the visitor experience, more restrooms. There'll be a garden, some art installations there as well. In the middle is Nash House. They're basically done with their phase one of renovations, basically repainting, stabilizing the wood, working, repairing wood ornaments on the house. They did provide some other exhibits that enhance the visitor experience as well. But hopefully, if I have anything to do with it, we're not going to stop. I propose to expand that house, namely because it needs an elevator, it needs more space. You can only get maybe 20 people at a time in the house. But more importantly, right now, Buffalo State College houses Reverend Nash's personal effects, and they have it in boxes. Okay, I don't know if anybody knows Dr. Monroe Fordham, but he was instrumental in getting his personal effects, what he thought would be, placed in a place where it could be protected. What we found was in a corner somewhere in a box. So we need to properly exhibit these items in a climate controlled facility. So we need to expand this house. The Colored Musicians Club is presently expanding their space. So on their 100-year-old plus structure, they're building a 2-story addition or expansion that would include an elevator, thank God. If you go, there's these really steep stairs. I'm getting too old to scale them. But it has an elevator, you'll have an elevator, classrooms, a gathering space. In the old structure, they'll be allowed now to expand their space for entertainment, for music. So they'll be going to about 150 seats, including a kitchen now. So they'll be really now competitive as it relates to other jazz clubs in the area. So these things, if you go down to the quarter now, it's basically a big construction site. What I'm happy about is things are finally moving there. After the pandemic, things slowed down, and the fear was, last year things were still slow because of the pandemic, the cost of everything went up, construction, those type of things went up. So now we're now in the midst of really moving on these projects. And the goal is within 2 years to have everything up and running and restored, and the only entity that's part of our anchor system includes Alford Radio and the Black Radio History Collective. They did not receive at the time any funding from the state. Namely because at the time when they moved in, they were a for-profit organization. Sheila Brown, who's the proud owner of Alford Radio, made a decision with her board to create a collective. So the radio station was founded in 1961, deep east side of Buffalo. But what makes them important is urban radio. Music drove, the civil rights movement. And Buffalo was a mover and shaker in the urban music, including Alford Radio. Some of your primary DJs started at Buffalo, and then they moved into other, opportunities around the country. There's one whose last name was OJ, Eddie OJ. So anyone familiar with the OJs, musical group? He named the OJs. He's attributed to naming them. They came to Buffalo when they didn't have a name. They were at the Colored Musicians Club, and where they were introduced to some people, including Eddie OJ. Someone wanted them to get up and perform. They agreed, and they said, "We don't know what to call ourselves." They said, "Call yourselves the OJs." So it kind of stuck. Okay. I don't know if you got any residuals from that. So some of the other continued progress that we're in the midst of presently includes the completion of our strategic plan and economic development strategy. I'm very proud of this. When I came on, I was directed by our board to really manage this. So we spent a year developing this strategy. this strategic plan, if you will. What I'm proud about it is we did it in the midst of a pandemic. So we did it primarily through virtual Zooms and things. But what we did with the help of the company, the consultant we hired, Moody Nolan, was we engaged the community. We had something close to 25 community engagement sessions that focused on what I call buckets of people that reside in our community. Folks who are educators, folks who are ministers and priests. We engage elders. We engage young people. When I say young people, not high schoolers and college students, we engage kids. We engaged political and elected officials as well. We did a number of focus groups. We did all kinds of meetings, primarily to draw from them what they envisioned the corridor, what they thought it should be. And what was created from that was a plan that the community immediately embraced when we formally announced it and presented it to the community and to the media, to our elected officials. The reason why is because they felt ownership to it. You know, there was consensus building. They felt that there were at least two other plans previous to this plan. Okay, they didn't go anywhere, and that's because the organizers, the developers, the facilitators of that did not reach out to the community to get what their take was on this corridor. And mind you, got people here in this corridor who've been living here for close to 70 years, 80 years. They've seen the heights of this corridor and they've seen the lows, and they were never asked, and we asked them. So that's what makes me the most proud about it. We are now really facilitating and implementing the plan presently. I already talked about the capital construction that's going on. This past spring, or last spring, the governor announced another $30 million of additional funding to our corridor for more capital projects, which includes property acquisition, okay? We need to acquire properties. In some cases, you have folks, families that are sitting on properties more than 30 years. And now they want to continue to sit on them because they think that there's now a cash opportunity. We're not doing that, okay? So we're working with the city to come up with ways and methods to either, you know what, or get off the pot kind of thing. We need to develop this corridor. I'm 62 years old now. We can't wait another 60 years, okay? We have the synergy, we have the funding, we have the community, stakeholders who are now expecting things to happen. And then another means of celebrating is we closed on our first property. We were able to buy property at 136 Broadway, which is directly across the street, and that's going to serve as our new headquarters and our visitor hub. One of the things that came from the strategic action plan was some things that the community said, or they said they envisioned for this corridor, some of which we already knew. We were just validated with their involvement. That included such things as, you need a headquarters. We don't know where to go to get information. If we're looking at tour, we don't know where to go to do that. So you need a headquarters. You need a place where we can go get information, to have community meetings. So this is our first foray into that idea in terms of providing those things to the community. A lot of the community also said they wanted to see Little Harlem come back, or the YMCA rebuilt. Okay, now I'm here to tell you, all those things are possible. They're possible. We don't have all this money, on trees, but what we have is now a synergy of people who are coming together. You won't believe the type of people who are coming together, not just locally, but from around the country, who want to talk about developing this corridor. It's the last bit of downtown development yet to have. And what we're trying to do is create, that messes up we go back here. Let's go back here. What we're trying to do is, this is what it looks like now. This is our aspirational slide. This is what we're looking to get to within 5 years, 8 years. Is a lot of it's not pie in the sky, okay? And This is primarily the corner of Michigan and Broadway. Okay, so if you look at here, over here, this big monstrosity is the Broadway garage. Okay, we're not buying that. We can't afford to do anything with it. However, I'm here to tell you, it just has not been announced formally yet, but the operations is moving out of there like fairly soon. So no more garbage trucks, no more snow removal equipment in there, which if you're doing the tours, kind of like kills the vibe when you come out after learning about Reverend Nash and you see a garbage truck right in front of the house. They're moving operations out. But more importantly, they now have a developer that they're going to name hopefully next week, who's going to develop that site based on our strategic plan. So that is that site is on the National Registry as well, if you didn't know. It used to be right after the Civil War. Time of the Civil War, it was an armory. Then in about the 1920s, 30s, they transformed it into what was called the Buffalo Auditorium. Okay, so that's where you had your wrestling, your bike races, your concerts. They had basketball tournaments in this thing. I think they even had swimming. At one time they even had swimming here. So the developers are looking to transform that back into basically a sports facility year round that could provide opportunities to folks that not just live there, but folks around the community. We may even think about putting a velodrome in there or an indoor track, year-round track, okay, to excite and promote track and field. There's nothing like that in this region. And colleges, high schools, everyone's looking for that right now. They're looking for that type of resource. So what we're trying to do here, if you don't know, is create a campus. So if you look at Riverworks, if you look at Larkinville, Canal Side, okay, you have these great lawns, and that's what people said they wanted. They wanted more greenery. They wanted more places where families can go. They wanted more eateries, okay. So one of the slides that I went by real quick was we're not just focusing on capital improvements. We have to create programming as well that could complement these anchors and complement this notion of creating this destination, if you will. So, so we're taking those steps slowly but surely, but we're taking steps towards that. We're presently working with the city to rethink how the street is. If you go down the street now, it's like Indianapolis 500. We need to slow the street down to create this family-friendly, safe campus. So we're working with Buffalo Urban Development Corporation, with Brandy Merriweather and Nathan Martin with the city to start that conversation. Reimagining the street, beautifying the street, activating these corners in between Broadway and Michigan. Again, this is another photo of the campus, if you will. But again, what we're looking to try to do is create a place where we can all be proud to not just learn about history, appreciate preservation, but more importantly, where you can spend the entire day, learn about those things, but then partying afterwards or going someplace to eat. Right now, if you go down there, it's like some old western town with the tumbleweeds over down there. We're changing that. And by the way, we're not waiting for capital projects to be done. We have a number of programs that are exciting people. When I came in, someone said, we see you all the time. We see on TV, we see things happen in Michigan all the time. But that's the point. We want to show that Michigan Avenue is activated fully, and we are open for business. We are fully bringing in programs and activities to excite the imagination, but more than that, to get people to want to live here and to do business here. And I'm going to close with this. There's a principle called Sankofa. It's from Ghana. It's a group of people in the nation of Ghana called the Akans. I think it's pronounced Akan. And basically, it's illustrated by a bird with its feet firmly on the ground, looking backwards, dropping an egg. And what that's supposed to emulate is, always looking forward, focus forward, but always remember where you came from. Never forgetting those stories, the history that made, communities like Michigan so exceptional. Okay, always say that we stand on the shoulders of so many. And I said I didn't want to embarrass her, but I see Miss Jean Woods out here. She goes to my church. Wave. Okay, she's one of the matriarchs of our church, and I love talking to her. She's one of my favorite people, but she tells you all these stories about Michigan Avenue. And she's a nurse by trade, and she came during an era when black folks wasn't accepted in a number of different professions, including nursing. And she came up under a woman named Eva Knowles, who was the first black trained nurse in Buffalo. And I remember when I worked at Roswell Park, we did a whole thing around Eva Knowles. I fell in love with her. We were able to get a day dedicated to her from the mayor's office. Roswell Park created a room for her with a portrait. And if you know Roswell Park, they don't give anything for free. Okay, they don't do anything for free. But the story was important, and I mention that is because with this notion of a Sankofa, we're all important. We all stand on the shoulders of somebody or other people. And we shouldn't forget who those people are. And the stories that are shared with you, the histories that you come from, that's all important. But it's important for African Americans too. We always have to push back against this idea that our stories are not that important or should be minimized in some way. I'm sorry to be political, but it's important to say it. We're all important, and that's why quarters like this is continuing to move progressively forward, because we have to continue that notion of Sankofa. So with that said, I'm going to stop. I think I ran into my Jeopardy time. I love Jeopardy.